This was New Zealand's last remaining oil refinery. Now it's an import-only terminal. How this still critical asset plans to fuel our energy future.
We can't restart it, and we've completely changed our business model. Our shareholders want us to be an infrastructure operator rather than a manufacturer of fuels now.
Welcome to Northland's Marsden Point. This was once home to New Zealand's last oil refinery, but it was shut down permanently in April 2022. The CEO of the company that owns it, Rob Buchanan, is taking us on a tour. It's the first time anyone's been allowed to film the site since the refining operations were decommissioned. It even looks old. It's rusting.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's what happens when you switch a piece of process equipment that's used to being hot and operating 24 hours a day. When you switch it off, clean it out, make it safe, the equipment does deteriorate over time.
Refining margins were under pressure. The company couldn't compete with cheaper offshore refineries. So the decision was made by the board and the company's shareholders to convert to an import-only fuel terminal. Hundreds of workers lost their jobs. The site that was once a hive of activity is now almost silent.
Incredibly sad thing for the community in Northland to see this asset close down in terms of economic opportunity and jobs. And our management team is determined to use these assets to bring some of that back.
There's little reminders everywhere though.
Exactly.
Refining NZ. The company is investing for its future and has built these new fuel tanks, leaning into their infrastructure purpose as a port that accepts already refined fuel, mostly from Asia, and stores it on site en masse, before sending it to Auckland down this 170-kilometre long pipeline. 3.4 billion litres of fuel passes through this facility each year. That's 40% of New Zealand's total petrol and diesel demand and 80% of jet fuel demand. So this is jet fuel?
This is a jet tank, that's right.
The company, now called Channel Infrastructure, is paying dividends to shareholders, with a compound annual total return to shareholders of almost 29% since the conversion. Its shareholders were once all the major fuel companies, but Mobil and BP have since sold out. Channel just announced a half-year profit of $16.6 million, an increase on the previous year of 45%, with fuel throughputs increasing and a new jet fuel storage contract signed with Z Energy. But the company is preparing for demand for petrol and diesel to drop off over the next few decades, as our economy aims to lower its emissions. But now we have an energy system in crisis, with gas set to be imported and coal being burned to keep the lights on. So how could this facility be repurposed to fit the reality of fuel resilience requirements? Rob, good to see you. Thanks so much for having us here.
Yeah, great. Thanks for coming up.
I want to start by talking about the shutdown decision. I know it's history, but partly that decision was made by the company and also its shareholders at the time because of these zero carbon aspirations, this shift to a lower carbon economy. How do you think that decision is aged?
Well, actually, the decision itself was made more on the fundamentals of refinery operation in New Zealand at the time. And it was an 18-month process, and the company at the time was actually criticised for taking too long with its decision-making process, but did it because it wanted to consult widely with all stakeholders. And the outcome of that strategic review was that there was no support for continued operation of the refinery. And that was an economic decision fundamentally around the economics of running what is globally a relatively small refinery in a small country like New Zealand versus large international refineries in Asia who are able to produce refined product at much lower cost. And I think in terms of your question as to how well it's aged, well, I think the thesis has actually played out as expected. If you think about what's happened to energy costs, the refinery used a significant amount of gas to run every year. So if we found ourselves in the situation that a number of other companies are finding themselves in at the moment, then we would be back to a very, very difficult situation.
I totally respect that it was a financial decision at the time. Refining margins were very much struggling when that decision was made. But what about the environment and the zero carbon economy future sort of played into that? Because I know that there has been some messaging around how that was part of the decision too.
Yeah, well look, there was certainly no support or political support at that point in time from the government of the day for continued operation of the refinery, and that's just a matter of fact because it shut down. We consulted with the government, and it's fully decommissioned now. So that was the environment that we were in, and that decision was made in. I think it doesn't change the fact, however, that fundamentally your ability to operate a small refinery in a small location like New Zealand and compete with the large global refineries, it was a really challenging situation for this business, and I don't think those fundamentals have changed, even if people's perception around what constitutes a low carbon economy has changed.
The reason I asked about the zero carbon economy is because you commissioned some research which you shared at your annual meeting late last year, which showed that petrol demand was going to start declining from 2030 and on that forecast completely disappear by 2050.
Yep.
You've now actually in the past few months, past year, seen petrol and diesel demand stabilise. It's actually increased by 1% and roughly 2%. Do you still expect petrol demand to disappear completely? Has your view changed on that with how things have played out now?
Yeah, I think it's easy for sort of short-term fluctuations to impact your thinking, but I don't think our long-term outlook has changed. Our long-term thesis continues to be that whether there's government incentives or not, electric vehicles will grow in share as they become a better and better product for the consumer. So I think the key challenge to talk about EVs today is that from a product perspective, for a number of consumers, it doesn't actually serve what they want, which is they're concerned about range, they want to be able to head away to Coromandel or wherever it is camping in the weekend, and they don't want to have to stop for half an hour to recharge their battery. That problem will be solved in time. And I think you only need to look at what's happening in China around production of very low cost EVs to see that I think that trend will play out. Now, we put out an outlook to 2050. By definition, it'll be wrong, but I think our thesis is unchanged around the long-term outlook for petrol use.
Let's talk about the decommissioning. What's actually happened in the decommissioning? How turned off are things now? Is there any possibility of turning them back on?
Yeah, so it's important to understand the difference between mothballed and decommissioned. Those are two very different terms. So back in 2021, when there was no support for continued operation of the refinery, the decision that was made by this company and its shareholders was to decommission the refinery. So when you mothball a refinery, that probably would have cost us 2 to 3 times more. And remembering our conversion budget was 220 million, so not an insubstantial amount of money. And when you mothball it, you are able to preserve aspects of the refinery for running in the future. But remember the environment we were in at that time, there was no prospect of future operation of the refinery. So it has been fully decommissioned. So the refinery itself, the decommissioning was completed at the beginning of this year. It has been made safe, it has been completely cleaned out, and it has been fenced off. There is no prospect or no possibility of turning it back on. What you are looking at to restart the refinery is not quite a complete rebuild, but a very substantial rebuild at cost of billions of dollars, I would expect. To get that piece of equipment going again. So the decommissioning is completed and there's no big green lever to turn it back on.
So that sounds like it's impossible to turn back on. You haven't just fenced it off, but you may have even poured concrete down the pipes, for example.
No concrete's been poured down any pipes. I don't know where that rumour got started. But
you can't restart it, bottom line.
It can't be restarted. Anything can be done with infinite amounts of money, of course, but as I've said, it would be billions and billions of dollars, which is funds that this company doesn't have.
So if there is a political wish to restart it, that would need to be a nationalised effort, not a company decision, because it's not at all feasible.
Yeah, well, as I said, we can't restart it, and we've completely changed our business model. Our shareholders want us to be an infrastructure operator rather than a manufacturer of fuels now, and that's been very clearly voted on several times by our shareholders. And so that's the direction that we're going in now. As I said, we don't have the billions of dollars, and then the other aspects in terms of logistics is the staff and the time, and so it would be a number of years to assemble the workforce, do the things that you need to do to get it rebuilt, and then you stand back and go, well, where am I going to get my electricity and my gas from at competitive prices to run it competitively versus those big Asian refineries?
Well, that's impossible right now, as we know.
Exactly.
Just on gas quickly, would you want an LNG, liquefied gas terminal here?
Yeah, well, look, a number of folks have spoken about several locations in New Zealand where you could build an LNG terminal. Certainly Marsden Point has a number of the characteristics which would be attractive for import of LNG. I spoke about our substantial landholding and consent, the jetty that we own with a natural deep water harbour, and we happen to have a gas pipeline pretty much to our front door. The challenge with our gas pipeline is that it's capacity constrained vis-a-vis some of the pipelines in Taranaki. So, from my perspective, and I've said this a number of times, we are absolutely here to lean into energy security for New Zealand. And if industry wants us to get on and work on an LNG terminal, and there's an economic model around it where our shareholders can get a return, then that's absolutely something that we would look at. But I think we're a wee way away from that at the moment.
On fuel security, what would be your summary of how secure our fuel supply is, given that we no longer have the ability to refine?
Yeah, so I think at the highest level, I think you have to remember that when we were a refinery, we were importing crude, and now what we do is we import refined product. So in terms of being exposed to international shipping lines, those types of geopolitical events that might interrupt shipping, nothing's actually really changed, to be honest. And I think the other thing that you've got to stand back and consider is when we had a refinery here, we had a single point of failure. Now, it never happened, but we have seen recently, actually last year in Australia, an example of a refinery that was in a maintenance turnaround, had an issue and had to be offline for a number of months. And if that had happened when we hadn't transitioned to kind of a stable import terminal system in a logical and sensible way with the fuel importers, then that would have been a pretty challenging event for New Zealand. So I think when you think about risk, you've got to think about all the risks, including the fact that we now are able to procure product from multiple refineries internationally, and that shipping aspect, I don't think that's really changed much from where we were previously.
Interesting, because everyone talks about the shutdown of this place as exposing us to supply shocks, to geopolitical conflict, but actually what you're saying is that now we can import, and we do import, more already refined products as opposed to just mainly crude. So it's actually done the opposite.
Well, look, that would be our perspective, is that the transition from operating a refinery to an import terminal has actually gone very smoothly from a consumer perspective. We haven't seen an interruption of fuel supply. We've seen, we get, I think it was last half, 33 shipments into this place. They come from all around Asia, and there's plenty of refined product out there that can be procured for New Zealand's needs.
We have minimum security obligations, MSO requirements, so they're called. It's effectively how much fuel supply we have to have for different types of fuel. Correct me if I'm wrong, 28 days for petrol, 24 days for jet fuel, and 21 days for diesel.
Yep.
Do you feel like that's enough? Because there's talk about increasing at least some of those.
Yeah, look, I think we need to remember what Channel's role in the industry is here. So absolutely, if there's a requirement to store refined product, we've got empty tanks that we can use to provide that storage. So,
can you give me a percentage on extra capacity you have?
So currently we have around 290 million litres of storage in service on the site, and we have about 400 million litres of unutilised tank capacity on the site. So
if they did increase, you'd be okay to do that
we
pretty
have
quickly.
A significant amount of unused tank capacity. There would be cost in converting that tank capacity, but there's absolutely no challenge with available tank capacity to deliver more storage. And sort of coming back to your original comment around the strategic nature of Marsden Point, that's exactly what we offer New Zealand, the ability to deliver that if that's required. I think on the question of is it enough, I think that's a matter for government and the fuel companies to form a view on, because none of this is costless, right? And the only entity that's able to make that decision and trade off cost of additional onshore storage and the impact to the consumer on pricing versus fuel security is the government.
On pricing, that's an interesting point, because the more that we have to hold, that price that those fuel companies are paying to store it would ultimately passed on to the consumer. But you here, Channel Infrastructure, would earn that money. So from a shareholder perspective, it would actually be in your benefit if storage minimum obligations are increased, because then you earn the revenue of it being stored here.
That's true, but we've got a number of other opportunities that we're chasing as well. And I think, in the last 6 months, we've delivered an additional $75 million of contracted revenue with PPI escalation. And, that's been driven by commercial deals with our customers to make their supply chain more efficient. And, I think if you think about our refresh strategy, which we launched last year, which was to be a world-class operator, customer-focused, lean into these opportunities, I think if we continue to do that, those type of opportunities come to us. I think we're going to sort of stand back and let the government make its mind up around what the right strategic storage number is, because as I said, they're the right people to apply on those trade-offs.
As a company, your finances have absolutely turned around post-conversion. You've gone from declining refining margins to now absolutely increasing margins just being an import terminal. Can you just clarify for me exactly how you make money? You effectively hold on to the fuel and the customers, the fuel companies, pay for that privilege, and that goes straight to your revenue, correct?
Yeah, so if you think about gas distribution businesses, electricity lines businesses, those types of infrastructure businesses, which are sort of sometimes referred to as tolling businesses. So effectively what we're paid to do by our customers is to make our infrastructure, including the jetty where they berth their ships, the tanks and storage equipment that we've got on our site, and then our pipeline to Auckland, available to them. And so the revenue model has an element of fixed fees and it's got an element of throughput or variable fees. But given the demand for fuel year on year tends to be very stable, that produces relatively stable revenues. And the benefit to us as a business, if you sort of stand back and go, well, we're looking for opportunities to make the supply chain more efficient or invest in more storage or whatever it is, means we become an infrastructure business with an infrastructure-like cost of capital. We can deliver our shareholders a relatively certain earnings profile, and that gives us a much lower cost of capital.
And there's no refining here anymore, so there's no operational costs really, other than a bit of maintenance.
Yeah, so we're very clear in our results what our OPEX costs. So electricity's about a quarter of it. We've, staff's another quarter, contractors would be another quarter, and then materials another quarter. So, yep.
Let's talk about the opportunities of this place, because you have 120 hectares of unused land currently.
Yep.
What's your plan for it? What are you going to put on it?
Yep, so we've got some big piece of work that's been undertaken over the last 6 months to try and understand the value of it. And if you stand back, we sit on a piece of land that's part of a special sort of local zoning, the Marsden Point Energy Precinct. And we've obviously got our consent around operation of the fuels manufacturing. We've got right next door to us, very significant electricity connection. So the 220 kV main line comes in very close to our site. We've got a gas pipeline, we've got a deep water harbour and a jetty. And so for the right opportunities and the right projects, that's an incredibly valuable piece of real estate that's quite difficult to replicate really anywhere else in New Zealand, perhaps even further afield. So we're working through our energy precinct plan or concept at the moment. I think, the first part of that is about, where are those additional storage opportunities? How can we deploy those unused tanks where there's an opportunity to do so? I think there are other potential customers that we are talking to and could talk to.
Purely for storage?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Maybe different kinds of storage products. And then there's what I call kind of the new energy projects. So we've spoken about our work with Fortescue around sustainable aviation fuels, which we think is a really interesting and exciting application for our site. If you think about being able to locate fuels manufacturing right on the fuel supply chain and deliver that product into Auckland Airport.
Do you think SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, is legit? Are we actually looking at a future where we'll have sustainable fuel going into planes?
Yeah, so we've done quite a bit of work on the physics and the chemistry associated with how you decarbonise aviation. And if you think about our fundamental challenge as a small island nation, a long way away from the rest of the world that's reliant on tourism to generate our GDP, as well as exports, often which go in the belly of a plane to generate our GDP. Leaning into that decarbonisation of aviation is a real challenge and opportunity for New Zealand. As it happens all around the world, people are already leaning into it. So we're seeing in Europe and the United Kingdom, Singapore, Japan's talking about mandates, which are basically mandating that a certain percentage of the jet fuel that's consumed in those countries is sustainable aviation fuel. And really the benefit of sustainable aviation fuel over electrically powered planes, for example, or hydrogen powered planes is your fundamental challenge for New Zealand is how do you get a big heavy plane with 250 people on it, 12 hours to LA or New York or wherever it is. And really you need a very kind of dense, energy dense fuel like jet fuel. And sustainable aviation fuel is drop-in. So it can go into existing gas turbine engines today, goes in all of our infrastructure, all the airport infrastructure everywhere in the world. If you think about your alternative of trying to fuel aircraft by hydrogen or electricity, not only do you have to come up with a whole new airplane concept, but you have to change the infrastructure out at every single airport everywhere in the world, and just imagine the billions and billions and trillions of dollars that would cost. So I think from our perspective, sustainable aviation fuel is a very logical and sensible and achievable next step to start on the decarbonisation of aviation.
Interesting. And what do you do with those hydrocracking old refinery, now decommissioned assets? I can still see them.
Yep.
The red and white
Yep.
piles, is that what you call them?
Yep.
So I understand you're selling them?
Yep, so there is a process that's ongoing to sell those assets. So we struck an option agreement with an entity called Seadra last year, and they've spent the best part of the last year undertaking front-end engineering and design for their project. I can't talk about it because it's commercially sensitive, but you're welcome to talk to them. We did say at our last results that the other parties that are involved in that project are Qantas, Renova, who are a Japanese renewable electricity company, Kent and ANZ Bank. So that probably gives you a bit of a sense of what those assets might be purposed for.
But bottom line, that will then create space for you to do something else like sustainable aviation fuel or more storage.
Well, that's the plan, remembering that it's an option arrangement, so whether it goes or not, it's not actually our decision, it's somebody else's.
Thank you so much for your time, Rob. Really appreciate you having us here.
No worries, thank you.
Thanks for watching Markets with Madison. If you enjoyed this interview, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. I do all of the research for these episodes myself, so your support means a lot. I always love to hear your feedback and ideas, so please drop any thoughts in the comments below. Now go put your money to work.